welcome to all of you who've joined us today for our webinar on centering culture to meet the needs of racialized children and young people. My name's Sarah Pinder, and I'm a knowledge broker here at the Knowledge Institute. I'll be co-hosting our webinar today with Evangeline Danseco, who's a senior child and youth mental health researcher who's also here with me at the Knowledge Institute. Evangeline's also presenting later in the webinar, so I'm going to give her a more fulsome introduction then. And we're just going to move on to the next slide to talk about a bit of housekeeping before we get started. So we really encourage you to use the Q&A feature to ask your questions to the presenters. And on the computer, you'll see this option at the bottom of the toolbar on your Zoom screen. We'll address your questions during the discussion period at the end of everyone's presentations. So sit tight if you're hoping to get your question answered. We will be reviewing them all at the end. Automated closed captioning is available for folks who want it. You can access that again on the bottom of your screen if you're accessing this webinar through a computer. And we're recording the webinar for future use on our website, so it will be shared there later. It'll also be emailed out to you. The link will be emailed out to you after the website, after the webinar today. And if you've got any technical issues today during the call, if Zoom's being a little cranky for you, you can contact Amanda or Nikki. They're our technical wizards on the call today. So their emails will be in the chat. So if you're having any issues, again, you can contact them using email or reach out in the chat for them. Thanks so much for posting those emails right away. And here's our agenda today. Here's what we're going to touch on. So we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement and then move into a welcome message from our executive director here at the Knowledge Institute, Purnima Sundar. We're going to hear a bit about why culturally responsive programs are important, and then hear an overview of cultural adaptation, responsiveness, and other terminology that's used to talk about this work. We're then going to hear an update from the Kenora region about implementing culturally responsive programs there. We're then going to have our Q&A section and then hear from Evangeline about the Innovation Initiatives grant program and their upcoming call for applications. And then we'll wrap it up. I'm going to hand things over now to Purnima, or no, I'm going to start with my land acknowledgement. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we're going to start today with a territory acknowledgement. And I'm joining you today from Toronto, which is the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. Toronto's part of Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'm a settler here of Irish, French, and Scottish descent. I also want to show you a picture of the land I'm speaking to you today from. So the image you see on the screen is the shore of what's now known as Lake Ontario. The lake is just a short walk away from my apartment where I live here in the west end of the city. Gathering together virtually means we're joining from different places. So I'm inviting you to consider your individual and collective relationships with and responsibilities to the Indigenous nations whose territories you're on and the land and water on those territories. If you want to take a minute to let us know the territory you're joining us from in the chat, that would be great. And if you don't know this information yet, we've posted a link in the chat to a searchable map you can use to look it up. It's important as we start this webinar to also acknowledge that there are long-standing health and well-being practices used by Indigenous nations across what's now called Ontario that existed long before settler mental health institutions were created and continue to be used today. And it's also important for us to acknowledge that colonial healthcare systems have been and often continue to be spaces where Indigenous people experience harm. And there's much for non-Indigenous people working in the mental health sector to learn and to change, to be in better relation to Indigenous children, youth, and families. I'm going to hand things over now to Purnima to make some opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much, Sarah, for that wonderful opening. I want to thank everyone for joining us here today, and just wanted to offer a few things to sort of get us started. We all know that racialized and Indigenous children and young people face a number of unique challenges to accessing relevant, high-quality mental health and addiction services, as Sarah has just shared with us. Poverty and geographic barriers, which are factors that disproportionately affect racialized and Indigenous people, can make it really difficult to access this kind of mental health care. Experiences of racism and colonialism also impacts the care of children and young people and families, and the extent to which they want to seek out care or receive that care individually within their communities. So finding services that center cultural practices, norms, and worldviews of racialized and Indigenous communities can be really difficult. And many mental health programs and modalities that we offer here in Canada and in Ontario were not designed with these communities in mind. But there is, however, promising evidence to suggest that centering the cultural needs and priorities of children and young people from racialized and Indigenous communities in mental health and substance use service provision can improve outcomes for members of these communities. And we're going to highlight some of the reasons why centering this work is important today. We're going to talk about some of the common language used, and we're going to hear from some of our colleagues around the examples from their work in the field and how this really reflects the way that we need to be moving forward. So prioritizing equity, diversity, and inclusion work is really important to all of you, and it is to us as well at the Knowledge Institute. We're currently working with our partners at Children's Mental Health Ontario to help set a strategy to support agencies across the sector to grow in this area. And our webinar today and our upcoming Innovation Initiatives grant that is intended to help implement culturally responsive programs are a few of the ways we're trying to advance work in this area. And so without further ado, I will shift back to our presenters.
Thanks so much, Purnima. And I'll hand things over to Evangeline to introduce Shreya, our next speaker.
Hi, good morning. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Shreya, who works as a youth advisor here at the Knowledge Institute. She works closely with our Youth Advisory Council to help include, support, and uplift youth voices in the decision-making processes. She has spent the last 9 years advocating for the prioritization of youth mental health promotion in Canadian education systems through analysis of current mental health policies, frameworks, and programs. Shreya's experiences in navigating the Ontario healthcare system as an immigrant woman of color inspires her continuous pleads for the integration of culturally inclusive practices within our healthcare system and services. She is currently completing her Bachelor of Health Sciences with a concentration in psychology at Western University. And if she has a spare time, she can be found reading or enjoying quality time with her friends and family.
Thank you, Evangeline, for that wonderful introduction. And hello, everybody. So again, my name is Shreya. I go by she, her pronouns. And before sharing why I'm here today, I'd like to thank the Knowledge Institute staff, especially Evangeline, for inviting and including me to be a part of this discussion. I'm extremely grateful for your generosity, and I'm really appreciative of our organization's continued meaningful efforts to make sure young people's voices are heard. So before I share my personal experiences navigating Canada's healthcare system and why culturally responsive programs are crucial for equitable navigation, I would like to acknowledge the land from which I'm speaking from, which is London, Ontario. London, Ontario is located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and Chinantan nations on lands connected with the London Township and Stamp Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. Starting my presentation with a land acknowledgement is one way to express the recognition and respect that I have for Indigenous peoples. However, it barely scratches the surface of the responsibility that I have as an uninvited guest and also a settler on this land to establish healthy, reciprocal relations with one another. I will consistently prioritize my relationship with Indigenous peoples and their land while continuing my commitment to reconciliation. I recognize that many of you meeting participants today are located all over Ontario and even Canada, so I do encourage you to consider the territory that you currently stand on and become familiar with its history. Before I get started, I'm going to quickly just go over agenda for today. So I'll briefly be going over my personal history, like I've previously mentioned, and then finally reinforcing the importance of culturally responsive programs. And then we'll be discussing next steps and closing out my presentation for today. So for me, I'm part of the Ceylonese Tamil diaspora. My parents are native to the country that is now known as Sri Lanka, and they fled the country due to the Sri Lankan Civil War and the mass genocide that continues on today in hopes of sustaining life and building their family outside of their dangerous war-torn homeland. So my siblings and I were all born in Singapore, where the conversation about mental health was non-existent. Though my parents provided my siblings and I with everything that they could in their power, the one missing component that significantly affected their mental health, and what I come to realize now has subsequently affected my personal mental health struggles, was familial community and support. The majority of my extended family had fled to Canada, and after my father had experienced a sudden loss in memory, which was a huge turn of events for my trajectory and in Singapore, my parents had decided that they didn't want to continue living in isolation, and we then immigrated to Canada. I was 9 at the time, and I was extremely unhappy as my siblings and I were essentially ripped away from our social circles that we knew our entire lives. And we were instead exchanged and provided with the promise of what was supposed to be a better life. That definitely wasn't the case because life was hard in Canada. Even though I was finally around extended family, connecting with my family was difficult, especially between my cousins and I, whom were all born in Canada, as our different upbringings left small room for common shared experiences. I also felt increased pressures to, in a sense, forcefully assimilate into Canadian culture and adopt westernized identities, norms, customs, traditions, perceptions, way of life, essentially, and more. However, with all the struggles that we were experiencing as being a new immigrant and also a person of color, my siblings and I felt extremely uncomfortable addressing our feelings with the two individuals that we felt the most comfortable with, which was my parents. As our family dynamics has shifted and significantly changed, and my mother had instead taken on the role of providing for the family while my father continued to recover from home. Now, looking into mental health support services wasn't necessarily a discussion that happened in my household because of reluctancy with engaging with the Canadian healthcare system that my parents specifically felt. So it wasn't an open conversation in my household. And my parents were always hesitant to discuss matters related to their personal mental health and the mental health landscape in total. And so we all suffered in silence as we didn't want to burden one another with each other's struggles. Now, as I sort of progressed through my experience as an immigrant through my upbringing, I normalized that struggle process. I thought it was just part of being an immigrant, and all my educators and supporters around me mentioned that it was just part of adjusting and that it would get better. It unfortunately did not, and I only came to realize that what I was experiencing was abnormal in my first year of university. It was a first year health sciences course that detailed explanations of specific symptoms, and specifically specific symptoms related to those that are in minority populations, that finally helped me click. And my sole focus for the longest time was to make my parents proud after all their struggles, that I had forgot to take care of myself and prioritize taking care of my well-being to my siblings in the process. So I only really realized the significant impact when I started to experience physiological symptoms such as ulcers, migraines, increased wants to continue sleeping, and more. As I sort of navigated the Canadian healthcare system, I was misdiagnosed multiple times, and that resulted in a lot of avoidancy and reluctancy of pursuing help after negative experiences with clinical providers or patient care providers. And though I'm in a better place right now, and I'm in a better place of acceptance, and mental health has become a much more open-ended conversation in my household, I still continue to face those innate struggles as I continue to try to find services that address my cultural needs and my cultural background. So after sort of explaining my personal and continued experience with Canada's healthcare system, I just want to tap in on how culture is interconnected to mental health. So culture influences people's beliefs and values, how they speak, how they dress, and other ways of experiencing the world. Much like so, it can also impact their mental health, including whether they seek help, what type of help they're willing to seek, and who provides their source of emotional support as they go through their mental health journey. It's important that we understand the role and the important role that culture plays in mental health care. And some ways culture impacts mental health includes cultural stigma, understanding symptoms, community support, and resources. For example, when explaining cultural stigma, every culture has a different way of looking at mental health. For many, and especially within minority communities, there's this growing stigma around mental health, and mental health challenges are considered a weakness and something to hide. Much like how I explained my personal perceptions of wanting to not look like a burden, this can also be reflected in other minority populations as well. So because of existing stigma, minorities are sometimes left to find mental health treatment and support alone. On that note, I'd also like to acknowledge the important and vital role that intersectionality plays within mental health outcomes. Intersectionality, as many of you may know, is a term that was first coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw. It recognizes that each of us possess more than one identity, a combination of various identity markers. Identity markers or social identities include our gender, our sexuality, religion, age, class, ability, race, ethnicity, and more. What do I mean when I say that intersectionality is so connected in mental health, or to rephrase, mental health is intersectional? It simply means that our mental health does not exist in isolation from the above identity markers that I previously addressed. As stakeholders in the mental health care system, it is our responsibility to acknowledge that our mental health is impacted by our various social identities, whether that be gender, sexuality, caste, class, age, religion, and more, and the unique life experiences and stressors that accompany these identities. Therefore, for those who identify as minority or disadvantaged populations, mental health outcomes are increasingly worse due to the compounding inequalities that they face. So for example, one of the many devastating examples is directly present in Canada, and it continues to persist within Indigenous peoples. Compared to white women, Indigenous women have a much harder time accessing quality healthcare, reproductive healthcare, and planning services that are specifically culturally surrounded, mainly due to the colonization practices that these systems were built on. The lack of access to these services can cause Indigenous women's physical and mental health to suffer. And if they do eventually access these services, they are subject to misdiagnosis and racism. There are also significant differences in the treatment of pregnant Indigenous women compared to their non-Indigenous counterparts. And this is, again, just scratching the surface. So to continue this conversation, why are culturally responsive programs so important? Now, for starters, I think you all may know, and I've alluded to this point, but our current mental health programs are not designed for ethnic populations. They do not consider the nuances that I've previously addressed, for example, cultural stigma, community support, familial support, and this may result in a lot of devastating mental health outcomes. For example, being less likely to access mental health services that are available, or being less likely to receive the necessary mental care, and specifically the specific culturally inclusive care that ethnic populations are looking for. This also will result in poor quality of treatment and being less likely to discuss their mental health and advocate for their personal treatment plans, because it doesn't regard the important factors in one's life and one's background. Another sort of main important point that I'd like to also address in terms of why culturally responsive programs are so important is because ethnic and racialized communities experience and report various different mental health outcomes. For example, in South Asian households, higher levels of anxiety, stress, and stress-related illnesses, for example, high blood pressure and heart disease, are more prevalent in these South Asian populations in comparison to our Eurocentric white populations. Another common increased factor that you might see in minority populations is this higher risk of depression and suicide. And I provided an example specifically that relates to Indigenous youth that outlines the sort of gaps in healthcare and the significant difference in mental health outcomes. So according to the Portrait of Youth in Canada data report, which analyzed the effects of mental health outcomes in current Canadian youth, it reported that Canadian youth are reporting worse mental health outcomes than older groups. Now, the same trajectory is seen among Indigenous peoples, where Indigenous youth are reporting and experiencing worse mental health outcomes in comparison to older groups. Now, in the conversation of ethnic and minority households, what I'd like to really emphasize is that we need to continuously integrate and look at these issues through an intersectional lens, and always integrate social determinants of health. So social determinants of health, like I previously mentioned, is those social identities that affect our experiences with our society. For example, the geography, our location, our social economic status, our race, our religion, all of these parts and all of these social identities play such a huge role in understanding how mental health outcomes will be different for one another. Now, finally, to more end on a positive note, because I am somebody who tries to stay as optimistic as possible, is that culturally responsive programs can increase positive mental health outcomes, and especially within ethnic households. So, for example, by providing culturally responsive programs, and specifically publicly funded culturally responsive programs, because we do want to keep in mind at the forefront that we do want to continue promoting accessibility, so increase accessibility to these programs, is the reduction of mental health stigma, because their cultural nuances and cultural backgrounds are considered within these mental health programs. This also will subsequently lead to increased accessibility to mental health services, because it will reduce the reluctancy or the hesitancy that a lot of minority populations experience when even seeking or attempting to access mental health resources. It also will ameliorate the chances of proper diagnosis, so correct diagnosis, and reduces that risk of incorrect diagnosis that many ethnic populations, including those within my personal peer groups, have faced. And overall, I want to sum up with the point that it will always create more equitable support services for all. I think when we look at culturally responsive programs, it's an excellent way for us to finally integrate that restorative justice and equitable service within our mental health programs. So what we need to put at the forefront of our planning moving forward is to consider these ethnic minorities and also include them within the prioritization and planning of these mental health delivery services. So I think from an individual level, I know Evangeline touched on my personal background with mental health promotion, but a way that I pursued, in a sense, sought after my personal experiences and sought after solutions for the experiences that I felt as an immigrant person of color, is to improve cultural competence in programming. So over the last 9 to 10 years, I've worked in various education systems and youth groups to try to advocate and increase cultural competency within mental health services, whether that be mental health training, mental health systems, and even mental health programming overall that's being accessed by students and by young people. So some individual components that we can practice on our personal and within our personal lives is promoting awareness and education. What that might look like is seeking after increased education. For example, researching resources, looking for any articles that might potentially address the importance of cultural competency within mental health programming. Another example is to incorporate culture-specific attitudes into your line of work. Now, the majority of my personal experiences have been extremely westernized and Eurocentric, where I haven't been able to identify with the workplace culture. And that's resulted in a lot of barriers in terms of being open about my personal struggles and being able to advocate for ethnic and minority populations like myself. So incorporating culture-specific attitudes into any line of work, whether that be conversations with your peers or conversations with professionals, it's extremely encouraging to continue moving this sort of movement that we're looking to continue. Another way to include and improve cultural competence is to recruit diverse team members and seek for these diverse opinions from various minority groups. Now, I've put in brackets consensually because we do also have to recognize that many ethnic populations, and for example, Indigenous peoples within Canada, feel ostracized or even tokenized during these conversations because they're felt as if that they're forced to provide their opinion. So within the sort of realm of seeking diverse opinions to understand more and to better cater to ethnic populations, we must keep in mind that what we're looking to do is to engage with them consensually and at their own pace. So for example, approaching individuals or community members who have explicitly mentioned that they're looking to share their voice would be a great way to start improving cultural competence and understanding more about their cultural needs in comparison to using tokenizing or demeaning approaches when trying to integrate cultural voices within mental health programming. So personally, with my current post-secondary education at Western University, I'm committed to mental health programming and the improvement and amelioration of mental health programming through my work at Active Minds Western. So I do work on the advocacy portfolio, and I lead the advocacy portfolio where we conduct multiple surveys across campus to understand the mental health landscape on our campus and also the London community in general. So in a week, we're actually releasing our mental health survey. And this year we've decided to target specifically and address issues that are relevant to international students and marginalized populations. Just because we noticed that there's a huge discrepancy between those that are from marginalized populations who are accessing mental health services on campus in comparison to their westernized white counterparts that are accessing mental health services, because of the main barrier, which is this lack of cultural competency. There is not enough cultural services that are being provided or our students are able to access. And that's something that we like to discover and investigate to help provide better solution approaches to the Western administration to integrate, to better cater really to their general population instead of catering to specific small in groups of individuals within the school. And there's sort of a picture of myself there that was from a recent gender-based violence protest here at Western. So part of what I like to do on an individual level, because I personally do believe that change starts from an individual level and then slowly increases to an organizational level, is promoting awareness, promoting education, and increasing my ability and my involvement within these projects of youth advocacy and specifically mental health youth advocacy. So just to close off, I wanted to sort of relay back to all of you today to sort of have a quick discussion on how you think you can encourage cultural competency on an individual level. Now, I've outlined a couple of options, and if you feel comfortable, feel free to either unmute yourselves or share some thoughts in the chat. But I, again, want to thank everybody for sharing the space with me and providing me with this platform to be able to speak on the importance of cultural competency. I hope you've been able to take away very important points that I've addressed today. And as we sort of continue this conversation, I'll be sure to share some resources that I found very helpful through my journey within the chat as we continue this webinar.
Shreya, thanks so much. I'm just going to say, I know that you're asking folks to participate now in discussion. I'm wondering if we can hold this just to our Q&A portion, just because I know we're running a bit over time, and I want to make sure we've got our time portioned out adequately, so we have time for discussion. Does that
Most
make sense?
definitely. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we will definitely return to this question in the Q&A portion. So please, if you do have thoughts or questions on this topic that you want to put in the Q&A section, so we can return to those in our Q&A portion of the webinar, that'd be great. I'm just going to hand things over now to Evangeline to introduce our next speaker, Madison.
Yes, thank you so much, Shreya, for sharing so passionately about your experiences and your actions that you've been sharing. We'll shift a bit now to hearing what the research says around culturally responsive programs. And we'll hear from Madison Urbach, who's a research assistant here at the Knowledge Institute. She has an honors Bachelor of Science in Psychology from the University of Ottawa, and her research focuses on the mental health of children and young people, particularly those with eating disorders. And she's also the first author for the overview that we recently released around culturally adapted programs.
Thanks, Evangeline. So at this point, we're going to take a step back to look at some of the terminology that's used in the field beyond cultural responsiveness. And at the outset, I want to point out that there are not necessarily standard definitions that are universally agreed upon, and that the field is constantly evolving. So not only do definitions of the concepts shift, but also the standard to which we're striving for, the best practice, that changes too. So my aim today is to illustrate some of the key differences between terms so that you can feel more confident in selecting an appropriate term for a given situation, while knowing that there's not necessarily one right answer. So we're going to look first at some terms that are typically used to describe individuals. So one of the first terms in this field that emerged as a concept, if we can just switch to the next slide. So this emerged in the 1960s, and this concept was cultural awareness, and it gave rise to other terms that we'll discuss later. And what cultural awareness means is essentially acknowledging that cultural differences exist between people from different cultures. So this is not requiring service providers to act in any particular way. It's just this recognition, this awareness. And this is seen as the first step. In order to demonstrate cultural sensitivity or cultural competence, first you have to be culturally aware. So then cultural sensitivity is very similar to cultural awareness, but it just requires service providers to go one step further. So in addition to being aware of cultural differences, culturally sensitive individuals must also modify their actions to be respectful or sensitive. And then cultural competence is also very similar to cultural sensitivity, and that's why we've placed them along the continuum in this way. And there are countless definitions of this term. Researchers are constantly putting forth their own definition, but almost all of them include an internal and an external component. So the internal component is really this knowledge of cultural differences, and the external component is often the skills to provide effective care to diverse populations. And those skills and behaviors can be different things in different definitions, but it often centers on respect. However, achieving cultural competency is often seen as a static outcome. So we see it as you do the training and then you are deemed to be culturally competent. But some people will ask, well, can you ever really be fully competent in another person's culture? And so criticisms like this have given rise to two concepts that were both developed in the 1990s, cultural humility and cultural safety. So cultural humility came out of writing done by American researchers, Melanie Turvalon and Jan-Marie Garcia. And there are three main factors to this. So the first factor is a lifelong commitment to self-reflection and self-critique. By this, it means that service providers have to be humble, flexible, open-minded, knowing that it's okay to admit when you don't know something about a person's culture or their personal experiences. The second component is about remedying the power imbalances that are present in client-provider interactions. So we're talking about client-centered care here. Service providers should recognize that the client is the expert on themselves, and they should be allowed to tell their own illness or wellness story, and also to communicate how much or how little culture is relevant to that story. So you do not have to be, as a service provider, an expert on all the nuances of different people's culture. You just listen to them and they will tell you what's relevant and how much of it is. And the third component relates to the fact that this concept actually originated among physicians who traditionally received training in university-based settings. So Tervalon and Murray Garcia are just arguing that service providers should actually be immersed within their community, and they should be receiving their training there, which can allow them to realize that health expertise can lie outside of the academic medical world. Like I said earlier, clients are actually experts on themselves. So in contrast with the endpoint that is implied with cultural competence, attaining cultural humility is a continual process. Service providers are always learning and growing from their clients. And then a related term is cultural safety. And this came out of work that was done with Indigenous nurses in New Zealand. And it posits that culture is not static, it's fluid, it's dynamic, it's complex. And second, cultural safety is both a process and an outcome. What do I mean by that? If we look at something like cultural competence, when we're focused on the process of how do we actually provide culturally competent care. With cultural safety, we're interested in that process, but we're also interested in the outcome. How safe did the client feel? So this is very similar to cultural humility in that it's focused on the client. It's not the service provider who determines safety, it's the client who decides whether their cultural identity has been protected. And these concepts that were discussed earlier, like cultural awareness, sensitivity, they've been criticized at points for promoting stereotyping, normalizing the othering of racialized communities, and de-emphasizing the structural oppressions that influence mental health outcomes. So both cultural humility and cultural safety are seen by some researchers as the next step in providing equitable mental health care. So next we'll look at some terms that are typically used to describe programs. And first up, we'll look at culturally responsive programs. So this approach originated in the education sector, but it's still very relevant to the provision of mental health services. So these programs are ones that focus on critical reflection and collaborative relationships between service providers and clients. And by focusing on the relationship, we can ensure that the client and the service provider both experience caring, respect, validation, empathy, and empowerment. You can see that this is sort of a related concept to cultural humility and cultural safety. But I want to point out that this term does not focus on the specific process for adapting the program. We actually see culturally responsive as an umbrella term, and both culturally adapted and culturally grounded programs can fit within this framework. So I will look at some of the key differences between culturally adapted and culturally grounded programs, but the way that I envision it is they sort of exist at either end of a spectrum. They're not mutually exclusive categories. And if you are someone who is involved in adapting programs to be more culturally responsive, you can certainly pull elements from both culturally adaptation frameworks and culturally grounded frameworks. So for culturally adapted programs, you typically start with an existing evidence-based program, and then you make more modifications to it so that it's more relevant to a specific cultural group. We call this a top-down approach because you're starting with an existing evidence-based program. But the downside of this model is that the adapted program may not be as relevant for the specific cultural group. And we know from the literature that programs that are less relevant can lead to lower retention rates. And then that ultimately affects the effectiveness of the program. If there are more people dropping out, it's not working as well. But on the other hand, because the adapted program is based on one that has already been tested and validated, the process for determining the effectiveness of it will be a lot quicker. And then culturally grounded programs are developed from the ground up. So what this means is that they are brand new programs that are co-developed all the way from inception to implementation alongside members of the target cultural group. And because these members are involved in the development, It ensures that the program has a high degree of social and cultural validity. However, the downside is that determining the effectiveness can be a lengthy process because the program is brand new. There's no pre-existing evidence base for it. And now that we've heard a little bit about the evidence and some of the terminology that's used in this field, we're going to hear about what culturally responsive programs can look like in practice.
Thanks so much, Madison. And I'm going to introduce Karen and Darsha, who've generously joined us today. So as Madison mentioned, our next speakers are going to be giving some examples of centering cultural responsiveness in mental health service provision. Karen Foster from Kenora Chiefs Advisory and Darsha Curtis from Firefly are here today to speak about their work on strengthening the braid. And Karen Foster, as a Chabik of Lynx Clan, is an Anishinaabe from Naikatchewanin First Nation located on Treaty 3 territory. She recently graduated from the University of Manitoba with a Bachelor in Social Work. Karen has 20 plus years of experience in social work, holding various roles throughout her career. She's worked with many First Nations communities across Northwestern Ontario and Northern Manitoba. Karen's passion and ambition have always been focused on being a helper and working with children, families, and communities. And currently, Karen's the director of Nigadanyang Bimadiziwin Child Development Services with the Kenora Chiefs Advisory. Her focus is to ensure that child development services are offered and provided to the 13 First Nations communities within the Kenora and Dryden areas. And joining her today will be Darsha Curtis. Over the past 18 years, Darsha Curtis has worked in nonprofit management, most recently as the Director of Service Excellence and Partnerships at Firefly, responsible for child and youth mental health, coordinated service planning, urgent response, complex special needs, and centralized intake. Before that, as the Director of the Transitional Age Youth Program and Assistant Director of Intensive Support Residences Program with the Kenora Association for Community Living. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology, focusing on deviance and social control from the University of Calgary, a Bachelor of Education from Queen's, and a Master of Arts in Organizational Leadership from Adler University. She's worked extensively in her community to address the impacts of racism, addiction, trauma, food insecurity, homelessness, and human trafficking. Thanks to you both for joining us today so we can have a bit of a conversation. I wanted to maybe start by getting you to tell me a little bit about your organizations, what your working relationship is like, and how that relationship started.
Bonjour, I'm Karen Foster. I'm the Director of Niganing Bimatizwin for Kenora Chiefs Advisory. So a little bit about our organization. We have a full line of services that we provide to 13 communities within the Kenora and Dryden areas. Child Development Services does offer those services to the 13 communities. And the Child Development Services started in 2017 with Kenora Chiefs Advisory. And as part of developing this program, we had to incorporate and develop partnership with Firefly in order to provide those child development services. In working together, we do work together with providing training for staff, sharing information, you know, the Western methods, the cultural methods, in every which way. Since I came on board in January, I've really focused on developing those relationships and improving those relationships, those working relationships amongst one another. I felt that when I came on board, it was kind of separated and there was really no clarity on it. Since then, it has definitely improved. We've invited them to, and they have participated in a couple of our retreats. We have also been in the process of enhancing our current service delivery model, which I'll speak about later on during our conversation. So yeah, that's a little bit of history regarding our partnership.
And Darsha, do you want to speak a bit about Firefly's role in this partnership?
Sure. Firefly is a multi-service children's agency that in Northwestern Ontario. So we're actually in 7 different communities, and Kenora is one of our largest ones. So Kenora Chiefs Advisory is one of our partners in the Kenora area, but we have a number of other unique partnerships depending on the communities that we're supporting. We are a lead children's mental health agency. We also are a children's treatment center. So we're unique in that way, in that we offer both the developmental services and the children's mental health services. And as you heard, offer complex special needs, coordinated service planning, all of those pieces, which our partners, Kenora Chiefs Advisory, also offer in a number of the communities, and in different ways we work together to offer those services.
Can you talk a little bit? I know that you're talking both about working, it sounds like pretty closely in relation. So can you talk maybe a bit about how that close relationship affects program and service engagement from youth, children, and families in the region? So when people come to either of you looking for services, how does your partnership affect the services that they receive?
First of all, I guess communication is key. We have managers that work within both NBDS and Firefly that meet on a regular basis and communicate on a weekly basis to discuss case management and service delivery amongst both organizations. So yeah, that is key. The other thing is that the training, the cultural congruence for staff, because in order to understand the people that you're working with, you need to have an understanding of where they come from, their history, the history of the people, the history of the community. As I mentioned, the enhanced service delivery model. You know, it's always so paper driven, and people always rely on stats, you know, because you do need to report that to funders. However, when you're getting those stories from First Nations people, from the families, you know, those are heartfelt stories that you can't obtain within one visit, within your first visit. You need to gain rapport with those people, with those families. So that's something that we're changing here with service delivery. And that's why I incorporated and said, you know, we're using the braid. And this is something that we incorporated about a month ago. We had a staff retreat, and that was our theme, was strengthening the braid, because we need to work together, because we're working for the same people, we're working for the same communities, but we can't do it standalone. We need to do it together and braid. Miigwech.
Gotcha. I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, our relationship with KCA, so I actually mentioned we have a lot of historical learning to do. So Kenora is located in an area where we know up to 5 residential schools were located really in close proximity. So the impact of those residential schools are really visible in our communities. So in relationship to KCA, they've taught us about how much learning we need to do and the work that's necessary, where we've messed up, where we've made errors, where we haven't served the communities in the right way. And now we're moving together forward in a different way. So our relationship provides us unique opportunities for teachings, and we're invited to different cultural ceremonies and pieces like that. And each of those opportunities changes the service that we provide. They teach us about slowing down and listening, as Karen mentioned, to those families, and really what true client-centered supports and services look like. So we are always on a journey. This has been a 40-year journey for Firefly. So it's nothing that's come quick. And as you hear, there are definitely moments where we struggle as a partnership together and hearing each other. And then we move through that. So that it's been an ongoing process over a number of years of just really listening to what our partners are saying and what the chiefs and the communities that surround us are asking for their children, and making sure that Firefly staff are listening to that, are doing the ongoing learning necessary. And then listening and how we approach each child. It impacts each child service because we have more of an individualized approach, an understanding of the different communities and ways that they belong. And as Karen mentioned, just being in community. So a big part of what we do with our employees is encourage their involvement in a number of different ways in our community. So whether that's sitting at food security tables, housing initiatives, different pieces like that, so we can really learn about what our communities are going through. And then invitations and relationship building with each community. So each family, each child, each family, each community is very unique that surrounds us. So as we're invited into those communities, it takes a tremendous amount of time to learn about each of those unique communities and what each of those chiefs are asking for and what those elders are asking for their children, and how Firefly can be helpful in that.
Thank you both for such generous responses. I feel like I'm really feeling very reflective about your ideas of the level of time and the level of commitment it takes to build these relationships and to build them carefully and thoughtfully, right? Like it sounds like you've really devoted a lot of intention to this project together of this relationship. Darsha, I know you've mentioned to me before when we've been in conversation that a piece of the work at Firefly is that you center an approach of supporting the autonomy of Indigenous agencies. Can you talk a bit about what that looks like in the day-to-day work that you do and in how you work with KCA?
Sure. So one of the examples is in the program, our developmental service program that Karen spoke about. And Firefly was invited into that partnership by the communities when they needed to offer developmental services to communities that they didn't have the resources to do. So we come in invitation and we work together in that, but our ultimate goal is always that the Indigenous agency has autonomy, that they eventually will take those services and build their own services and work with that. So in our every interaction, every proposal we write, in how we transfer funding, who has power in conversations and the decision making, those are all important aspects that we're ensuring that voice is the most powerful. We're moving funding as easy as moving funding, so that that community, that chief, that team is directing Firefly and is the one holding sort of the power in that decision making around how those children will be serviced and supported.
And Karen, I know that you've mentioned that and given some examples already of KCA being using a very client-centered model that centers Anishinaabe values and practices. And I know you've given us some great examples already of how that looks a bit different, how that looks at your agency versus a non-Indigenous agency. Are there other examples you'd like to offer about how you provide services and how they might differ from non-Indigenous service providers?
I guess you could say that, you know, based on some of the outcomes of our past retreat last month, some of the things that, you know, is because we can always do better, right? So some of the things that was kind of brought up by staff was, you know, the need to have the information, the knowledge of our communities, because that's something that we don't have currently. So with saying that, the elders that were present at our retreat, gladly stated that we need to approach our elders for that information, and incorporating them also in our case planning with, on how to provide child development services using the culturally, from that cultural lens aspect, and utilizing the land, utilizing the items that they currently have in their home. You don't need the iPads or technology. Like, utilize the items that are currently in their home, and utilize the land. That is the one I guess suggestion and advice that came from the elders that were present. And in fact, the one thing that they also mentioned was that the next retreat between Firefly and NBDS should be on the land. So that's what we're going to be planning for the spring of 2023.
Oh, that's great.
So it's just things like that. And then also, as I mentioned, we do incorporate the cultural teachings with staff, and having them at such as ribbon skirt making. Tomorrow we're actually having ribbon shirt making for the men. So Firefly staff are also invited to that. And it's just things like that. And a very good example that I'll give you is one of the directors from Firefly actually came to our powwow, the Kenora Chiefs Advisory powwow this summer. So teaching her the protocols of the powwow, the use of the tobacco, those sorts of things are, things that we share amongst one another, whereas she shares the information with me on how, the Western methods, the clinical methods of, speech and language, occupational therapy. So it goes hand in hand. That's partnership. Miigwech.
Yeah, thank you for giving those examples. I wanted to ask you both, I feel like in conversations I've had with stakeholders at other agencies, I often hear things about from folks who are maybe much earlier in their journeys of starting relationships with organizations that are led by or serve Indigenous or racialized communities directly. So I wanted to ask you both if you're open to sharing some insights or lessons learned on your relationship building process and on working towards making programs more culturally responsive. Do you have any kind of general thoughts that you'd like to share, folks who are maybe a little earlier on the road than you both are?
Spend time together in relationship, focus on that relationship. So as Karen mentioned, we're invited to different things. We have different opportunities, and we honor those invitations. We feel very honored to have received an invitation like that, so we prioritize that. Being invited into a community, spending time with a chief, spending time with an elder, receiving knowledge or teachings from individuals sort of is sprinkled throughout our relationship with working with KCA. Attending powwows, being invited to a sweat. These are things that when our staff or practitioners are invited to do, change them individually and their practice moving forward, and then impacts our organization and our community as a whole. So we're very respectful of that, and that's what our partnership with KCA, they invite us into these opportunities to learn and be continuously learning. We mess it up off sometimes, but we're starting to listen, continuing to listen in different ways. So that I would say, if you're invited to a sweat, if you're invited to a ceremony, if you are receiving a teach, if an elder is spending time with you and starts to share the historical significance, those are the moments that really matter. And that's what you need to prioritize for your staff. So looking as a settler organization at your leadership and your priorities, what does your strategic plan say? Where are you prioritizing clinical work? So as Karen mentioned, being on the land is important. So where are you offering services? Firefly got a lot of feedback around, get out of your offices, come out to the land, bring our children to the land if you're going to be offering services to them. So we're listening to that more and more often and really looking at how we can apply that to our work.
Thank you. Karen, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I guess I just kind of want to mention again about, you know, learning about the history of our people. And the one thing that we're actually having in a couple of weeks, and again, I've invited and encouraged our partner, Firefly, to join us. But we're going to have a session on trauma-informed. So we're also incorporating, that's a one-day session, but we're also incorporating a sweat ceremony, a sweat lodge ceremony at the end of it, and a wellness circle. So those are like, that's just, you know, these are things that are happening, and I feel it's bringing us closer together as partnership and understanding of, you know, the cultural congruency of, because we're always evolving, right? There's always changes. And yeah, I agree with Darcia. It's not always a smooth road. Just like any other partnership, any marriage, you know, there's bumps along the road, but we always come together. We, you know, having that understanding of one another. Again, you know, as leadership of the Firefly and MBDS, like, we need to be role models also. So we do work on our working relationships, and for the sake of, you know, the service delivery that we are providing. Miwach.
I'm thinking so much about both of your comments, just about the idea of showing up, and showing up in a very committed way to the relationship and to the community, really. Like, I'm reflecting a lot on both of your comments related to that. Thank you again for those generous responses. I'll maybe wrap us up for now with one last question, which is just to ask you both how you measure or evaluate success in your programs.
It's a very interesting question. So for me, it's the invitations. So when a community calls and says they're in crisis and says, could Firefly come and be part of this with us? To me, that speaks to our relationship and the safety and the pieces that matter the most. Definitely. So the number of kids I also watch, so access is an important piece. So the number of kids that are receiving service that identify as Indigenous is one piece, but what about all the children that aren't receiving service? As we talked about, that's an important piece. And that's where, again, my partnership with Kenora Chiefs Advisory and the members of the mental health team really talk to, like, the reasons why Firefly's maybe not seeing kids, or how we can engage kids in a different way, or youth in a different way. Again, on the land, in partnership with them, they've built a wellness camp and have beautiful properties. So, and our partnership, they allow us to provide services in different ways. We've built roundhouses. We have different opportunities to offer services in different ways in our partnership with them. So how we measure is in the number of invitations. When there's a new program or new opportunity and we're invited in, we take that quite seriously.
I guess from Kenora Chiefs Advisory, NBDS, how we measure, I guess, that we are actually providing the services in the communities is, just to give you an example. This past summer, we actually did a tour of all of our communities and advertised our program, the services that we're able to offer their communities. In having the networking with the community resources, being involved with their health fairs, being invited and to the communities where they're asking for, can you help us with children's activities? Can you do this? Can you do that? We definitely take up on their offers because, as I mentioned, with the way we're enhancing service delivery, this is what I've told my staff, as well as the clinicians of Firefly that attend our communities. If for some reason or another, your appointments don't show up for that day, whatever the case may be, go to the school, go to the daycare. I'm sure there's probably an event happening in the community. Go and be with the children. Go and make yourself visible, like, with other in other roles. Just be there for the community. Like, make your time worthwhile in the community, even if that means that child 1, child 2 didn't show up for their appointments. Then go elsewhere and but be in the community, because that's one thing that that was pointed out during these meet and greets that we did throughout the communities, was visibility, access to services, and that we don't want clients to have to come to Kenora for the services. We need to provide the services to the communities where they don't have to go out of their community. Miigwech.
Yeah, thank you both for such great and very concrete examples of your processes here. And again, thank you for so generously offering to agreeing to speak with us today. I really appreciate everything you shared. We're going to move over into our Q&A, our more broad Q&A section of the panel today. So I'd invite other speakers to join us back on screen, and Evangeline to help me co-facilitate. And again, if you've got any questions that you'd like us to ask our guests today, feel free to enter them into the Q&A box, and we will jump on responding to those for you. I think maybe the way that we could start, I know we had to kind of press pause on Shreya's discussion question from earlier in the presentation. So maybe it's worthwhile to return to that and ask the panelists, but also I would love to hear from folks in the chat who are audience members about how you can encourage cultural competency on an individual level in the work that you're doing. Also, Evangeline, I feel like I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you have any insights you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I was just about to say, I think about 2 weeks ago, there was an article in the Globe and Mail by Jody Rybold Wilson about framework, because she often gets asked, what do I do? What can I do about the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations? And she put forward the framework, which is 3 parts, called, said first learn, then understand, and then act. So before moving to action, because we're often so quick to trying to fix things, let's learn and understand, and then work in partnership with the community, as what Darsha and Karen have been sharing here. And then the steps towards that action can be clearer. But so that's what's been helpful, and that's been sort of in the back of my mind this past couple of weeks. Just and what one of the participants, Lena Algumeri, was mentioning about listening, to really listen and be present for those activities or events in the community. I remember about 10 years ago here in Ottawa, the Wabano Health Center organized a number of events around culture as treatment. And so I learned a lot about the Indigenous approach to wellness. And so then I was thinking about, Shreya, your comment about how sometimes when we come from cultures where mental health is not recognized or it's in denial. But I wonder if that's more the influence of colonialism. And if we go back to our original culture, if there are also a lot of that wisdom and the teachings similar to the Indigenous frameworks or the Indigenous worldview that really honors a holistic approach. I'll leave it at that for now.
Do others want to jump in? Maybe Madison or Shreya?
Yeah, just sort of touching back on Evangeline's point, you make an excellent point on the effects of colonialism on mental health perspectives. I can personally speak on, I'm not too sure about the mental health perspectives, at least in my personal cultural background, but I know the significant effects of colonialism that's impacted my personal South Asian heritage and culture. For example, the clear example that really comes to mind that I continuously see on a day-to-day basis, at least on a university campus, is homophobia. And at least within my personal culture, I've always been told and silenced really that, any relations outside of heterosexual relations are not accepted within the culture. I recently found out that's actually not the case, and there's many scriptures that promote and encourage that idea, and it's indeed colonization that affected and sort of shaped the molding of modern culture and modern ideologies within culture. So I really want to sort of really resonate with that point that you made, because I think, at least coming from a cultural background, I sometimes forget the impacts of colonization within my personal backgrounds, and that when I'm sort of reminded by your message, I continue to reflect on how colonization has impacted various other ethnic populations. I think the key one that always comes to mind is the colonial norms that have, seeped and contributed to the determinants of Aboriginal and Indigenous mental health. But I'm really appreciative of you highlighting the impact of colonization in these conversations.
I see that we've got a question from the audience here that maybe the group might have some insights to share on. Someone is asking, what are some ways to encourage education for people who may have misinformation that may impede on practices of cultural competency or building cultural competency? Do folks have thoughts about that they'd like to share?
I guess if I'm understanding the question correctly, some people might have misinformation about different cultures. I think the frameworks and the concepts of cultural safety and cultural humility can be really relevant, because you really exist in the state of not knowing and being curious and asking people about their culture. So if you can encourage people to maybe do some readings on concepts like that, rather than trying to learn everything that they can about different cultures, and then maybe sometimes you're going to get things wrong. It's all about being curious and asking people questions, staying open-minded and staying flexible.
I know from Firefly's perspective, we just embed the learning and the teaching into our work. So right from onboarding on, we're setting sort of a tone and a culture at our organization around continuous ongoing learning. Each individual is on their own path and in different places, and we respect that as well. But it's really about embedding all these pieces of equity, diversity, and inclusion into the culture of an organization as well. So we have a number of committees, we have a number of opportunities like book clubs, and our trainings often always have a piece of it built in. So it's just ongoing learning, and we're just kind of moving forward and learning together all the time. And that's a really important piece. And then we find that individuals that really don't fit into the culture end up leaving. So that's a big piece of what we've been trying to do, and that we're trying to do ongoing, is really embedded into the culture of our organization.
Yeah, I appreciate those points about organizational embedding, and also just like exposure through repetition for people as well too. Shreya, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just adding on to Darsha's point, I think one way to sort of go about meaningfully integrating equity, diversity, and inclusion is to view EDI as a policy change or a policy reform instead of a checklist. I think what we're noticing with a lot of organizations is we continue to prioritize the numerical goals. And I understand that we can't get rid of them, and that in a sense, the business world will continue to measure things in numbers, and that doesn't really stop us. But at the same time, we need to stop the approaching EDI, whether that be EDI training or EDI facilitation, like a checklist, and instead find ways to change the policies within our organizations so that either employment is more inclusive overall and the workplace culture itself truly integrates equity, diversity, and inclusion with the way that we practice. And I think another sort of, I mean, it might come off as really, self-explanatory, but really teaching the importance and emphasizing the importance of respect in workplace cultures and respecting everyone can go a long way. I think acknowledging the fact that everybody comes from different cultural backgrounds with unique aspects and nuanced interactions, and always facilitating and prioritizing critical reflections and respect in practice instead of theory could also take us a long way.
And I see that we're getting some folks are jumping in on the chat to say they're appreciating that expressing it should not be treated as a checklist or like something we need to complete and get done and then move on, but like a whole orientation or a way of being. I think that's really important to highlight. And Evangeline also has dropped training available on anti-racist mental health care that's offered through the University of Ottawa. It sounds like it's free, but you just need to make an account to access that. She's put a link in the chat. I think we will maybe wrap up our Q&A section now and transition over into Evangeline presenting about the Innovation Initiatives Grant Program. So thanks so much for all of you jumping in on the Q&A period. I'll introduce Evangeline Danseco now for the last portion of our webinar. Again, as I mentioned, she's a senior child and youth mental health researcher at the Knowledge Institute, and she's a credentialed evaluator through the Canadian Evaluation Society. She's leading the Innovation Initiatives program that we're going to hear about today and the evaluation of Ontario's post-secondary helpline. And she's led recent provincial projects such as a scan of organizational practices in advancing racial equity, the evaluation of the shift to virtual care, and a systemic review of secure treatment programs. So I'll hand us over to Evangeline. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to all the panelists. As we had mentioned, it was mentioned earlier that we had work. A lot of the initiatives relating to providing staff training and having the partnerships, it was also a lot of those things that emerged through our survey around racial equity in terms of what are the practices organizations are doing. And one of the areas there that we had surveyed or asked agencies was about providing culturally responsive programs. And we did noticed that not a whole lot of agencies have their staff knowledgeable about this. And so we wanted to focus on culturally responsive programs, which we've heard from Shreya earlier, how important it is for children and young people and families from racialized communities. And it's all to be able to improve services and hopefully to improve equity, diversity, and inclusion, so that in the end, mental health outcomes will be improved for everyone, including racialized children, young people, and families, because we cannot assume that the current treatment models that we have necessarily apply or will be effective for racialized people. So the Innovation Initiatives Program, it's for any of those Ministry of Health funded agency for child and youth mental health and addictions programs. If you're also already doing or implementing an evidence-based intervention or practice. Now, we did mention something about a culturally grounded practice, so I'll mention that later. And we want to be able to also invite agencies who have partnerships with their communities. So you're not working in silo, but you're actually engaging and involving young people, family members, and your community partners in implementing or evaluating a culturally responsive program. So these are our priority areas, and they're within an implementation science framework. So you can be at an early stage where you're still just determining whether there's a specific evidence-based program that should be adapted, or if you're wanting to develop a culturally grounded program from the ground up. And second area would be you want to pilot, you've already determined you have the elements or core components of this program and you want to pilot it. Or you have already piloted a program and you want to scale it up either across your entire organization, or you want to partner with other agencies in another service area potentially, or within your service area in your community, so that the program exists more substantially across all the different agencies. And the last priority area is around evaluating and improving a culturally adapted program. In our overview that Madison had led, there are some literature there in terms of what are some things, some potential challenges, but also some considerations. So the innovation initiatives in previous iterations, we've funded them for 50,000 for 18 months. And we've adjusted this for this year, for this round, to 75,000 for 18 months, just considering the importance of this, this focus. And projects are hopefully will start in March and end in August for an 18-month period. The deadline to submit applications is on December 15, before all the Christmas rush, the December rush, 4 p.m. And there's an email address there where you can submit questions. So this is what the website looks like. You can look for the innovation initiatives, and there's a button to apply now. And you can also consult the application guide, and the application guide will include the questions that will be in the application. So, and it has some tips and just a repeat of all the eligibility criteria, what to include in the budget, and all those wonderful things. So I think that in a nutshell is the innovation initiative, and I hope that the presentations today and what people have shared have intrigued and made you more curious about how to implement a culturally responsive program in your agency.
Yeah, we're really grateful to all of our presenters, Karen, Darsha, Shreya, Madison, and you, Evangeline, for your informative presentations and insights today. And we really appreciate you sharing your time. And thanks as well to our superstars behind the scenes, Amanda Davis and Nikki Summers, for helping make all the mechanical bits and pieces work. And again, we'll be sharing this recording on the Knowledge Institute's website shortly after this webinar, in case there's anything you missed or you want to review again. And you're going to receive a brief evaluation survey when you exit the Zoom webinar. Thanks again for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.